Genesis 3:15, the first promise after the fall. The first promise in the Bible was spoken at the very moment everything seemed lost. But it was not first spoken to Adam. It was not first spoken to Eve. It was spoken to the serpent. Human beings had broken trust with God. Shame had entered the garden. Fear had replaced openness. Adam and Eve were hiding among the trees, blaming one another, unable to undo what they had done. And inside that moment of judgment, God announced that the serpent would not control the ending. Genesis 3:15 is only one verse. Yet, within Christian reading, it becomes the opening note of a conflict that stretches from the garden to the cross, from the empty tomb to the final pages of Revelation. It does not explain every page by itself, but it introduces a tension that the rest of Scripture will repeatedly deepen. The promise was not that the serpent would never wound. The promise was that the wound would never become the serpent's final victory. To understand why that matters, we have to return to the garden before the hiding began. Genesis describes a world of order, provision, relationship, and limit. The man and the woman were not surrounded by scarcity. They were given abundance. But one boundary remained. They were not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then the serpent asked a question. Did God actually say? The first attack was not physical. It began with interpretation. The serpent did not merely point toward forbidden fruit. It changed the way the woman was invited to see God's command.
Knowing good and evil.
A limit began to look like deprivation. A warning began to sound like control. Something they had not been given began to feel more important than everything they already possessed. That pattern is painfully human. A desire becomes stronger when we begin to believe that something essential is being withheld from us. A boundary feels offensive when we stop trusting the person who established it. And once trust is damaged, even generosity can be reinterpreted as manipulation. The woman ate. The man ate. Their eyes were opened, but not in the way they had imagined. They saw their nakedness. They covered themselves. When they heard God in the garden, they hid. Then came one of the most haunting questions in Scripture. Where are you? God was not asking for coordinates. The humans were hiding from the presence they had once lived within freely. Adam answered with fear. Then came accusation. The man blamed the woman and indirectly blamed God for giving her to him. The woman blamed the serpent. Everyone explained. No one could reverse the choice. The fall was not only the breaking of a rule, it was the breaking of trust. Trust in God, trust between human beings, and even the human ability to stand honestly in the truth. Consequences followed. Pain, conflict, difficult labor, mortality, and exile entered the human horizon. But before Adam and Eve left the garden, God spoke to the serpent. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall strike your head, and you shall strike his heel. The language is compressed and mysterious, but it speaks of hostility, descendants, a wounded heel, and a blow against the serpent's head. In its immediate context, the verse does not name Jesus. It does not mention the cross or the resurrection. The Hebrew word often translated offspring or seed can function collectively, referring to descendants. Its grammatical form alone does not prove that the verse speaks exclusively about one future individual. That distinction matters. We do not need to make the text say more than it says in order to recognize what later happens within the biblical story. The verse introduces a conflict. The serpent can cause real injury, but the blow against its head points toward a more decisive defeat. The wounds are not equal. One attacks the heel, The other attacks the source of the serpent's power to continue. Later, Christian tradition would call this verse the protoevangelium, the first announcement of the gospel. That name comes from later interpretation, not from Genesis itself. Christians read the verse in the light of Jesus, the cross, and the resurrection. But Genesis does not rush there. First, the promise must pass through a world where violence grows almost immediately. Cain kills Abel. The first death recorded outside the garden is not caused by age or accident, but by one brother rising against another. If the future depends on human life continuing, the story already appears to be collapsing. Yet the family continues through Seth. This does not completely explain Genesis 3:15, but it establishes a pattern the Bible will revisit. Violence causes real loss, and still the story moves forward. By Noah's generation, violence has filled the earth. The flood becomes both judgment and preservation. Humanity is not preserved because it has become innocent. The same human problem survives the waters, but life is not allowed to disappear. Then the story narrows. God calls Abraham and promises that through his offspring, the nations of the earth will be blessed. But Abraham and Sarah are old, and Sarah is unable to conceive. The promise is attached to a family that cannot produce the future. It has been promised. Isaac is eventually born. Then Isaac himself is placed under threat on Mount Moriah before being preserved. The promise advances, but never through an untouched path. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers, sold, falsely accused, and imprisoned. The wound comes from within the family, carrying the promise. Yet, the rejected brother later becomes the means by which that same family survives famine. The injury is not imaginary. Joseph loses years he cannot recover. Preservation does not erase betrayal, but betrayal does not succeed in ending the family's future. Generations later, Pharaoh orders Hebrew sons to be killed. The threat is no longer infertility, famine, or family violence. It is state power turned against children. Moses survives the decree and eventually leads Israel out of slavery. Again,
not every enemy
we should be careful.
Is a direct embodiment
the
of
Bible
the
does not say that every enemy is a direct embodiment of the serpent, or that every threatened child is a separate fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. The connection is not a secret code hidden inside every event. What develops is a narrative pattern. Promise, threat, suffering, preservation, and a future that repeatedly appears impossible until it continues. With David, the promise takes on a royal shape. God promises that David's house and kingdom will have an enduring future, yet the monarchy fractures. Kings fail, Jerusalem falls, the people go into exile. Once again, visible history seems to contradict the promise. Then Isaiah speaks of a servant who suffers, is rejected, bears grief, and is ultimately vindicated. Victory is no longer pictured only through power. Somehow, suffering itself enters the shape of deliverance. By the time the Gospel of Matthew opens, the story is carrying centuries of waiting. Jesus arrives within the line of Abraham and David. Soon after his birth, his life is threatened by Herod. The pattern of danger appears again, but now the Christian reading begins to concentrate everything on him. Jesus confronts temptation, sickness, oppression, accusation, and death. He announces God's kingdom, but the story does not move toward an obvious political victory. It moves toward a cross. And here Genesis 3:15 becomes more than an interesting beginning. At the cross, the promised one appears defeated. His body is wounded, his followers scatter. His enemies believe the threat has been removed. The man Christians confess as Messiah is executed publicly, placed in a tomb, and sealed behind stone. Nothing looks like victory. This is where the story must slow down. Christian faith does not claim that the wound was an illusion. Jesus truly suffered. He truly died. The cross is not a symbolic inconvenience on the way to triumph. It is the place where evil, violence, accusation, human injustice, and death appear to achieve their greatest success. But then the meaning reverses. The New Testament presents the cross not only as something done to Jesus, but as the means through which sin and death are confronted. The apparent victory of evil becomes the place where its claim is broken. The serpent wounds the heel, but the wound does not end the promise. On the third day, the tomb is empty. The resurrection does not erase the crucifixion. The risen Jesus still bears wounds, but those wounds no longer testify that death won. They testify that death did everything it could and still could not keep him. This is the center of the Christian reading of Genesis 3:15. The descendant wins by being wounded. The cross looks like the serpent's final victory, but the resurrection reveals it as the beginning of the serpent's final defeat. Revelation later identifies the dragon as that ancient serpent, connecting the final conflict to the garden. Interpretations of Revelation differ, but its movement is clear. Evil is judged, death is defeated, the curse is removed, and the tree of life appears again. The Bible begins with a tree, a questioned word, a serpent, and human beings hiding from God. It ends with the tree of life, the curse removed, and the presence they once feared becoming the home they no longer need to flee. That does not mean every painful event in your life will produce visible success. It does not mean every loss will be restored before death. It does not mean suffering is secretly good, or that faith requires pretending you were not hurt. Genesis 3:15 offers a more sober hope. A wound can change a story without receiving the authority to finish it. The serpent could wound the promise, but it could not become the author of its ending. Perhaps that is why this ancient verse still matters. Many people live in the space between what they believed and what they can currently see. They know what it is to watch trust collapse, to carry consequences, to wait through silence, or to wonder whether something broken can ever be restored. The Bible does not answer that fear by denying the wound. It answers by placing a limit on what the wound can finally accomplish. So here's the question to carry with you. What wound have you quietly allowed to become the final interpretation of your story? Share your answer, or simply the word hope in the comments if this passage changed the way you see Genesis 3:15. And if you want to explore familiar biblical stories with historical care, emotional depth, and respect for what the text does and does not say, subscribe to the channel. The wound was real. It simply was not final.